Dear friends, welcome to the 18th lecture of the Aligarh Society of History and Archaeology (ASHA) and Ganga Jamni collaborative series on our shared past and its historical sources. Last week, Supriya Gandhi spoke about Majmaul Bahrain of Darashikoh. Today, we have Dr. Daniel Sheffield, who will tell us about Dabistan and Mazahib, a work that examines and compares South Asian doctrines, religions, and sects of the mid 17th century. The authorship of Dabistan is debated, though recently it has been claimed that the question has been satisfactorily resolved. Some scholars mention Mohsen Fani as the author. Others say it was Esfandar. Still others say it was Mobid. I, however, will refrain from any comment on this issue, but instead introduce you all to today's speaker, who in turn will talk about the Dabistan. Dr. Daniel Sheffield is an assistant professor in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. He is a specialist in the history of early modern Iran and South Asia, with a focus on the social and intellectual history of Zoroastrian communities. His first monograph, Cosmopolitan Zarathustras, Translating Religion in Iran and India, the result of extensive manuscript research in the Parsi libraries of Gujarat and Bombay, is currently under publisher's review. He is the author of numerous published articles which can be found on his academia.edu page. He is working on a second book project focused on the followers of the Iranian thinker Azar Kaivan, whose teachings strongly influenced the composition of the first Persian language encyclopedia of comparative religion, Dabistan-e-Mazahib, which one can translate as the School of Doctrines, written, according to Sheffield, as Mirza Zulfiqar Azar Sasani Mobid in 1060 Hijri, that is 1650 CE. Today, Dr. Daniel Sheffield will talk on comparative religion in early modern India, the school of doctrines, Dabistan-e-Mazahib, in historical perspective. Welcome, Dr. Sheffield, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Rezvi Nadim Bhai. It's such a pleasure to be here as a part of this series. I've been watching eagerly every video that seems to come out almost every day or every other day that you've been a part of and that Ganga Jamni has enabled. And all I can say is that it's absolutely an honor to be included in this series of extremely eminent scholars that you have brought together here. As I was saying to Professor Rezvi over email and before our lecture began today, I was hoping to spend this year, which is my sabbatical year, in India, and was hoping indeed to be visiting Aligarh around this time. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic hit and made these plans unfortunately unable to be actualized. But it is absolutely a delight to connect with you guys virtually and to be able to talk a bit about my research, my recent research on Azar Kaivan and the Dabistan Mazahib with you today. Professor Ezvi has already alluded to some of the controversies which have adhered to the text of the Dabistan Mazahib, controversies which are quite long-lived in scholarship, extending all the way back into the 18th century, when the Dabistan, as an encyclopedia of comparative religion in the early modern Indian world, composed in the middle of the 17th century, first attracted the attention of European Orientalist scholars, notably Sir William Jones, who first brought the text to the attention of the English reading public in 1789. Today, we have considerably more evidence at our fingertips about the composition of the Dabistan than did William Jones. And so I'm going to be reviewing in the first part of my lecture, just very briefly, some of the historiography which surrounds this fascinating text, a text which, among other things, describes the religious world of the 1650s in great detail, providing the first biography of Kabir, providing a first-hand narrative of the author's encounter with the Sikh Guru Gur Hargobind, providing again another first-hand narrative of the author's encounter with the Sufi poet of Jewish origin, Sarmad, and providing one of the most detailed accounts of the debates which took place at the Ibadat Khane of the Mughal Emperor Akbar. So I'm going to share my screen and begin my presentation here, but I'm especially looking forward to the conversation and the questions, which I hope will come at the end of my lecture. Okay. Okay, so I hope you all can see this. I'd like to begin my presentation with a line of poetry composed by a poet who wrote under the pen name Mubad. The word Mubad, Mobed, is a term originating from the Zoroastrian religious tradition, which refers to a ritual priest in the Zoroastrian tradition. I'll just read the poetry first in Persian and then in my translation. Chand dar pas kuchhay mazhab u millat ravim, shah rah keshvar tahqiq joz elhad nist. Let us stroll a while through the alleyways of religion and nation. There is no highway in the land of research except heresy. I want us to take this line of poetry, which is drawn from the Divan of the poet Mubad, as it's preserved at the Khuda Bakhsh Library in Patna, as an invitation for us all to spend the next hour or so roaming these alleyways of religion together with Mubad, who I will argue here in this first part of the talk is in fact the author of the work known as the Dabistan Mazahib, as I've translated it, the School of Doctrines, which was completed in its first recension in the year 1650 of the Common Era, 1060 of the Hijra. This text, named the School of Doctrines, sets as its goal to describe the religions of the peoples of the world in commensurable terms. Each religion is presented as a lesson of a syllabus leading to an apprehension of the true nature of religion, Haqiqat-e-Din. Throughout the text, the author, Mirza Zulfikar Azar Sasani, writing under the pen name Mubad, speaks in the first person, relating stories of encounters with diverse religious figures drawn from his travels across the Indian subcontinent and beyond. Prior to composing the Dabistan, Mubad traveled widely for what he called independent verification, tahqiq, From what we can ascertain about his life, he spent nearly 30 years moving across the expanse of the Indian subcontinent, seeking out members of diverse religious groups who could explain their stances on philosophical questions, as well as issues of doctrine and ritual. In the process, he was also shown numerous religious texts, many of which he excerpted for the Dabistan. At the conclusion of the work, which you can see here on the slide, the author likens his work to that of a translator. Summarizing his method, he writes, "In this land of conduct and abode of doctrine, what has been written about the doctrines of various sects comes from the tongues of the followers of those doctrines and their books. As for the accounts of the notables of each sect, they have been accorded respect in the same way their followers and sincere friends describe them, so that not even a whiff of zealotry and partisanship should arise. The author deserves nothing in this account other than the rank of translator, Mansab Tajmani." Then he concludes characteristically with a line of Persian poetry, here quoting the Persian poet Sa'di. "In short, it is only an image which will remain of us, for we can see no permanence to our being." Now, the Dabistan is recognized as an important, if idiosyncratic, record of a pivotal moment in Indian history, one that is characterized in popular memory as a moment of Mughal convivencia characterized by universal peace, Solh-e-Kol. The Dabistan records, for instance, the earliest outsider description of the Sikh, or as it refers to them, the Nanak-Panthi community, and it provides virtually the only detailed account, although we should perhaps take them with a grain of salt, of the religious debates which took place in the Ibadat Khaneh of the Mughal Emperor Akbar a half century before its composition. The author of the Dabistan was evidently well connected to the philosophical circles which joined Safavid Iran and the various Muslim states of India together. And he provides first-hand accounts of meetings with a cast of characters ranging from monarchs to revolutionaries. Beyond the interest in the Dabistan for the historical moment it records, the text exerted considerable influence since the time of its composition. Here on this slide, just a brief account, a brief table of contents, if you will, of the contents of the Dabistan, a work which is organized around the idea that the text itself is a pedagogical tool, a school, literally, in which there are 12, I've translated them here as classes, teachings, ta'lim, each of which corresponds to one or another of the larger religious groups with which its author is familiar, and each of which is subsequently subdivided into a number of smaller sections or lessons, as I've translated them, nazar, pertaining to the various subgroupings of, on the one hand, the Persians, the Hindus or the Indians, the Tibetans, the Jews, the Christians, the Muslims, and then a number of other groups about which we'll speak in a few minutes. Recently, we have remarkable new evidence which confirms that the author of the Dabistan is, in fact, a man called Zulfikar Azar Sasani, who was known by the poetic name Hubad. We have, in fact, two different recensions or versions of the Dabistan, which reflect an earlier sort of first draft or composition and a later composition. While the texts in the large part agree with one another, they diverge in several notable places, especially with regard to the second chapter, the chapter on the religions of the Indians. But the most important manuscript of the Dabistan only came to light fairly recently, published as a facsimile in Delhi, first in 2010, This is the manuscript that I refer to here as the Alpha Recension manuscript, completed in 1060 of the Hijri or 1650 of the Common Era, which was copied in the same year, on the 8th of the month of Shawwal, by a scribe by the name of Muhammad Sharif ibn Sheikh Mian Sipahi, who was born in Medak near Hyderabad. And the colophon of this manuscript tells us that the same manuscript was checked with Mubad himself, and it gives his full name, Zulfiqar Azhar Sasani, checked with Mubad by Mubad's student, Majduddin Muhammad, during the same month of Shawwal. Indeed, that there exists two different recensions of the Dabistan was already noticed by Professor Irfan Habib, who found several manuscripts in Aligarh University Library, which also reflect this earlier version of the text. The version, however, which most scholars are familiar, and indeed most of those who have cited the Dabistan over the course of the last 200 years, is a later recension, what I've called here the Beta Recession, which must have been completed sometime between 1063 and 1068 of the Hijra, or 1653 and 1658. It's this version of the text, which one can find in countless manuscripts, numerous manuscripts just at the British Library alone, but manuscripts which it can be found in most of the Persian manuscript libraries in India, several of the Persian manuscript libraries in Iran, and several other places in Europe and in North America. It's also this later recension that was the basis for the printed editions of the text, beginning with the first printed Persian edition in 1809, the English translation of 1843, and all subsequent publications until the publication of the Alpha Recension in 2010. Now, one of the reasons why this new manuscript, newly rediscovered manuscript of the Dabistan is so important is that it contains within it the notes of the author as they were dictated and written down by his pupil during the checking of the text. And here you can see several of those notes in the margins of the beginnings of the second chapter, the chapter on the beliefs of the Hindus. Some of these notes are very simple. For instance, here you can see a simple correction. You can, for those of you who can read Persian or in Urdu, you can note that the scribe wrote the word, he wanted to write mojudat, existent beings, but he only wrote mojuda, and someone, that is Mubad's pupil, added a t, a te in the margin. But others of these notes are more detailed and reflect both the need to explicate passages of the Dabistan which the author felt were unclear and which were subsequently added in the second recension, or to correct passages that he thought were incorrect in what had been written. So here you can see, again, for those who can read Arabic script, that the chapter on the Hindus actually begins with the invocation Sri Paramatmaya Namaha, transcribed in Arabic script. And here an explication of what that means as dictated by Mubad. And you can see the letter Mim at the bottom here stands for the name of Mubad. After beginning Hu, just he, the name of God, the note continues. Sri is the Sanskrit, in Sanskrit is a word of honor, just as the word Hazrat is in Arabic. Param is what they call the absolute omnipotence of God. Atma is the rational soul, the nafs-e natiqeh, Namaha is great reverence. Sometimes they write Paratma instead of Paramatma, and the note sort of continues on from there. So for anyone who is interested in the sort of, not just the sort of contents of these encyclopedic texts which circulate in the early modern Islamic world, but indeed in the process of editing and redacting this knowledge, the discovery of this 1060 AH manuscript is really a goldmine, because it gives us a really clear idea of how the editorial process took place, whereby Mobad redacted his own composition. Now, apart from just manuscripts of the Dabistan itself, several other works have come to light in the past several decades, which shed further light on the author of the Dabistan and the context in which he lived. So the first of these to be discovered was noted by the Patna historian Syed Hassan Askari, who, working in the Khurabaksh Library of Patna, discovered a manuscript called the Divan-e Mubad, which shared a great number of lines of poetry that were also found in the Dabistan, as well as other poetic works which Mobad had either composed outside of the composition of the Dabistan itself, or after the composition of the Dabistan. We know that the Divan must have been compiled after the Dabistan, because while in all of the texts of the Dabistan, the Mughal prince Dara Shikoh, who was Mubad's direct contemporary, was still living. In the Divan, we find poetry which mourns the death of Dara. So we know that the Divan must have been completed sometime after 1659, the Common Era. The manuscript that we have of it, though, is a 19th century copy, copied by a Parsi priest, presumably in Bombay. More recently, that is just in my own research and in collaboration with colleagues who have been working, especially in the Deccan in Hyderabad, several other compositions which are related to Mubad have been discovered. First, a series of short works in pure Persian, that is Persian with no Arabic loanwords, composed by Mubad in praise of Abdullah Qutb Shah in 1057 of the Hijra, 1647 of the Common Era. We have at least 3 manuscripts in Tehran which include these texts. And finally, we also have several letters from the Qutb Shahi court during the period of the 1650s and 1660s, which refer both to Mubad and to his literary activities in Hyderabad. Just show one of those here. This, as you can see on the right, is a long letter in Persian from Nazir al-Mamolek Haji Abdul Ali Tabrizi to Mirza Moin, in which sort of down towards the bottom, he describes some of the recent compositions of Mubad, and he describes his own efforts to obtain a copy of the Dabistan. And here we also get a sense that Mubad's compositional style was very much in vogue in Hyderabad during this period. They refer to his style as the Tarz-e Bostani, or the ancient style. And here our letter writer really endorses Mubad's style by saying his elegant pen has drunk the milk of divine secrets from the breast of spiritual and worldly mysteries. Now, if that's not a sort of endorsement for a blurb on a book, I don't know what is. Over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, the Dabistan was widely copied. In 1787, the Calcutta Orientalist Sir William Jones described it as containing, quote, more recondite learning, more entertaining history, more beautiful specimens of poetry, more ingenuity and wit, more indecency and blasphemy than I ever saw collected in a single volume. On the whole, it is the most amusing and instructive book I ever read in Persian. Unfortunately, it was also Jones who identified its author not as Mubad, but as one of the earliest poets quoted in the first chapter of the Dabistan, namely the poet Mohsen Fani. This appears simply to have been an error on Jones's part, but one that was reproduced by generations of Orientalists and other scholars following him. A partial English translation appeared in 1789, followed by a full English translation in 1843, which was begun by the Irish merchant and not particularly good Persianist David Shea, who died when he was about, I think, 20% done with the translation. It was then continued by the Austrian autodidact Anthony Troyer, who was also not a particularly good Persianist, and thus the 1843 translation of the Dabistan, still the only complete translation in English, is not particularly reliable, especially in as much as the text concerns sort of technical matters of religion. Neither of these authors were particularly well versed in Islamic studies, or for that matter, Zoroastrian studies, or in the sort of Indic religions. And they made a lot of basic errors in the course of their translation. Now, interestingly, the Dabistan has also been translated into a number of Indian languages. The Gujarati translation of the first chapter of the Dabistan was actually the very first book ever printed by a native-owned printing press in Bombay, and also, therefore, the very first book published in Gujarati by a native-owned press. I think there was a calendar that was printed by the same press, by Fartunji Arzbanji. You can see an image of the first page of the Dabistan in Gujarati here on the left. And an Urdu translation was also made towards the end of the 19th century. It was published in 1896 posthumously, the translation made by Pandit Shradharam Pilori, whose name might be familiar to those of you who are familiar with sort of Hindu revivalism in the 19th century. In spite of the great popularity of the Dabistan, basic questions remain about the context of its composition. Here, just some of the title pages of the Persian editions of the text. What motivated the author of this singular text to adopt a seemingly non-partisan, even-handed approach to religion, an approach which he contrasted explicitly with the genre of Islamic heresiography? At the end of the work, Mobad says that he is familiar with works such as Shahristani's Kitab al-Malal wal-Nihal and the work Tabsirat al-Avam, both of which describe other religions from the standpoint of a Muslim polemicist. So what led Mubad to take a different approach to religion in his Dabistan? The leading 20th century German-American scholar of Indian Islam, Anna-Marie Schimmel, described the Dabistan as a, quote, strange work on comparative religion and, quote, utterly confused. Basic questions regarding the authorship and the intent of the work continue to occupy considerable scholarly attention. Who was this Mubad, this author of the Dabistan? Was he Muslim or Zoroastrian? Was he Sunni or Shi'i? Was he part of a Sufi network, or was he an eccentric outsider? Was he a forerunner of liberal toleration, or was he a reviver of ancient wisdom, as in some places he presents himself? At the conclusion of this paper, I will try to build up an argument that the difficulty in categorizing Mubad as belonging to one or another of these groups or of these tendencies is symptomatic of the spiritual exercise of the composition of the Dabistan itself. So to start to try to answer this question of who was Mubad and what was he trying to do, we can begin by trying to piece together what evidence we have of his life, primarily from the evidence of the Dabistan itself. Here I've provided a map of most of India, together with a little bit of the sort of surrounding regions, that is Iran and Central Asia. Surprisingly, the Dabistan is quite detailed in providing dates for the dates in which Mubad encountered various religious figures. And though the text isn't organized chronologically, if we try to aggregate these dates, basically by scanning through the entire text of the Dabistan, putting all the dates together, a certain pattern emerges as to where Mubad was active and when he was active in those places, what he was doing in those places. Just briefly summarize the data which I've tried to put together here on this map. Briefly summarized, during the early part of Mubad's life, he moved from Patna, where he was born in 1618 of the Common Era, to Agra, probably before he reached the age of 5. And from Agra, he continued to Kashmir, a place that he would be based for a number of years, that is for approximately the next 2 decades. During this period, Mubad seems primarily to have met members of a group of mystics who were followers of the Iranian thinker Azar Kayvan. It's this group of thinkers whom he describes at great length in the first chapter of the Dabistan, the chapters on the religions of the Persians. Many of these thinkers had met Azar Kayvan during his lifetime, and who were evidently quite aged by the time that Mubad met them. During the middle part of his career, he was active primarily in the Punjab and Afghanistan. At this time, he was evidently associated with several figures of the court of the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan, and began more frequently to report meeting Hindu and Muslim figures. Here you can see, for instance, that he would frequently move between Kashmir and Lahore, and occasionally, either from Kashmir or Lahore, venture out into Afghanistan or other places in the Punjab. At one point in 1053 of the Hijra, making a pilgrimage all the way to Mashhad in Safavid, Iran. It seems that this trip to Mashhad, at least according to the text of the Dabistan, was the only time in which Mubad left India. During the third phase of his career, the last documented portion of his life, that is from around the years 1055 of the Hijra down to the sort of latter part of the 1060s of the Hijra, or the period between 1645 1659, it seems that Mubad, for an unknown reason, began to move south, moving via Rajasthan and Gujarat into the domain of the Qutb Shah Sultanate, where he stayed for a number of years in Hyderabad, and where it seems that he had become a chancery officer, according to the letters which I alluded to earlier, of the Qutb Shah court. He composed a composition in pure Persian in praise of Abdullah Qutb Shah in 1057 of the Hijra, and the first recension of the Dabistan was completed in 1060 of the Hijra, probably somewhere near Hyderabad. Following that, he seems to have continued eastward to the city of Sikakul or Srikakulam, and of course, modern Andhra Pradesh, the capital of the kingdom of Kalinga. And it's here that we began to lose track of him. We think that it's probably in Srikakulam that the second version of the Dabistan was composed, and perhaps he stayed here for the remainder of his life. So from this picture that I've presented here of the movements of Mubad, what emerges is then an image of an author who is not as politically disconnected as others have tried to present him. Not an eccentric, but rather a figure who was never far from a royal court in spite of his many travels. That's not to say that the Dabistan was an explicitly imperial project, but as we have seen earlier in earlier presentations in this series, ideas of sainthood were closely intertwined with ideas of kingship in early modern Islamic ethical thought. Similar activities in exploring the metaphysical richness of religious diversity while asserting absolute political authority, legitimized through the notion of universal peace, were acts of royal self-fashioning and instruments of political authority. Some of this, I think, was discussed in Professor Gandhi's lecture last week on the Majma al-Bahrain and Dara Shiko's own interests in exploring the intersections of Islamic and Hindu religiosity in his Majma al-Bahrain and in his Sir Akbar. So to begin my presentation to try to answer the question of why it was that Mubad set out to document the religious traditions of his time, I'd like to briefly discuss the thinkers who influenced him at an early age. Those thinkers that he describes in the first chapter of the Dabistan. He refers to them variously as the Sepasis, or the thankful, or the Yazdanis, or the sort of worshippers of God. These are the followers of the Iranian mystic known as Aza Kevan. During the 16th and 17th centuries, throughout the Persian-speaking world, the sort of imagination of Iranian religion, and by Iranian religion, I mean the religion of pre-Islamic Iran, evolved in new directions, both in India and in Iran. And Aza Kevan was a part of this reimagining of ancient Iran. Pictured here are two illustrations from the Persian Book of Kings, one produced in the Safavid court in the year 1605, the other produced in Srikakulam, perhaps one that Mubad himself could have seen in the 1660s, perhaps, or 1670s. And what you can see in these images is something remarkable. That is, these ancient Iranian topoi, these ancient Iranian scenes are being reimagined in new ways. First, in the image on the left, we see the ancient Iranian king Gostasp having just slain a dragon. And when he does that, what does he do? Well, in this manuscript, he gives thanks, he prays. And what's remarkable about this imagining of Gostasp is that in this scene of prayer, he is depicted as praying in the Shi fashion. Right? He is shown as praying with a moher, or a seal, on his prayer rug, and a tasbih, a rosary, next to it. So on the one hand, in Iran, there is a tendency to Shi'ize ancient Iranian history. Likewise, on the right, we can see similar attempts to imagine ancient Iranian history through this sort of visual vocabulary of Dekhni painting, of Indian painting, where here the hero Esfandiar, also slaying a dragon, is depicted with a characteristically Indian turban and Indian fashion of dress. Azar Kevan was an important part of this reimagining of the place of ancient Iran as a fountainhead of eternal wisdom that would find resonances in both Islamic and in Indian thought. Very little is known about the historical details of his life, but what we can ascertain comes primarily from the books associated with his followers. Kevan is said to have been born in the ancient capital of the early Sasanians, the city of Istakhr, in 1533. He attracted a school of followers in mid-century Shiraz, where he composed a visionary treatise narrating an ascension through the heavens, ultimately reaching the divine presence. He promulgated a work which he claimed was the genuine scripture of ancient Iran, and which in its earliest portions had been revealed many millions of years ago. In its latest portions, redacted at the court of the Sasanian monarchs, that is the last of the pre-Islamic dynasties of ancient Iran. Reportedly, Azar Kevan was invited on several occasions to come to India by the Mughal Emperor Akbar to take up employment in the Mughal court. And eventually he did leave Iran during a rather chaotic period of Safavid history, traveling via Shiraz to Zabolistan in Bukhara, and ultimately winding up in Lahore. Kevan died at the age of 85 in 1618. And according to the hagiography of his followers, throughout his whole life, Kevan followed a strict regime of spiritual exercises premised on a theory of macrocosm that linked the celestial spheres with realms of human society and the human body. In Kevan's own narration of his ascension through the heavens, he writes, "First, I prepared my body and adorned it according to the physician's creed. I abandoned my old religion, all my desires for rites and doctrines. I ceased to speak, neither good nor ill did I speak to anyone. In a dark place I sat and abided. I lessened my food. I ceased to sleep. I proceeded exhausted. Never did I rest from God's memory. Beside him, all my misfortune seemed the same." Here we see how in Kevan's thought, the microcosmic level of the human body, the mesocosmic level of society and religion, and ultimately the macrocosmic level of visions of the cosmic spheres relate to one another at the level of spiritual exercises of the saint. The passage describes Kevan by preparing his body according to the physician's creed, presumably referring to a kind of universal natural philosophy. He adjusts his diet to eat only a small amount of food and practices wakefulness. He abandons any form of religious partisanship and indeed speech itself. This practice prepares him for a vision of the celestial spheres and ultimately allows him to ascend in his experience to the divine presence. A commentary on this passage from the Dabistan tells us that following Azar Kevan's practice, a follower of the path of Kevan must know the art of medicine so that they can bring their bodily humors into harmony with one another. They must banish all beliefs of religion, custom, doctrines, and paths. They must be civil or have peace with all. Ba hame sulh girad. You can note the sort of resonance between sulh ba hame and sulh kol. Sit in a narrow and dark place and eat less by degrees. Here then, this harmonization of bodily humors is linked directly to the practice of universal peace, sulh ba hame, and ultimately celestial harmony. Now, As I've mentioned, Keyvan promulgated a work which he claimed to be a work of scripture, a work which described the religion of ancient Iran as it existed from before the time of Adam down to the time of the fall of the Sasanians. But from the perspective of someone who works on the history of Zoroastrianism, the text looks very strange because what it describes, rather than being sort of typical Zoroastrian doctrine and typical Zoroastrian ritual, is rather a series of prayers which address the planets, the planetary bodies. Here you can see just a sort of short breakdown of the contents of the Dasatir, in which the whole sort of middle section here consists of prayers to the 7 planetary bodies, that is Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. Indeed, much of the contents of the Dasatir were surely the composition of Azar Keyvan himself, and further, we can now demonstrate that much of the contents of the Dasatir consists simply of translations into Persian from earlier Arabic language writings of the philosopher As-Sohrawardi, who lived during the 12th century of the Common Era. Nevertheless, the Dasatir lay the foundation for a universalist project. It claimed a common source and a common end to all of the exoteric religious traditions of the world. It says that all of the religious traditions of the world are derived from this primordial tradition. One, here just some evidence of the close word-for-word translation from As-Sohrawardi. Don't need to spend any time on this. One interesting manuscript of the Dasatir held in the British Library, following the contents that I just outlined, very interestingly collects prayers in a number of languages from a number of different religious traditions, which in the commentary are all described as being litanies to various planetary bodies. Thus, following the text of the Dasatir, here in this British Library manuscript, we have texts given in the ancient Iranian Avestan language here. This is a Zoroastrian hymn to the sun, as well as texts in other languages such as Sanskrit, Turkish, Arabic, and so on. Here, a Sanskrit text transcribed into Persian script in a litany to Niranjana, to the one without qualities or without color. This manuscript of the Dasatir is likely to be a 17th century manuscript, perhaps one similar to a manuscript that was known to Mubad himself, and one which lay sort of a foundation for a kind of comparative project whereby prayers in Persian, in Avestan, in Sanskrit, in Hindi, in Turkish, and in Arabic were all presented as being fundamentally equivalents and translations of one core essence. Azar Keyvani texts frequently refer to the notion that all languages, and by extension all religions, were derived from a common source, and that they were thus ultimately mere translations of one another. This idea is again ascribed to ancient Persian doctrine, which negates any exclusive or non-universal claims to truth. In or around 1618, another follower of Azar Keyvan by the name of Bahram ibn Farhad, something of a sort of intermediary figure between Azar Keyvan and Mubad, who had studied in Shiraz before he came to follow Azar-Kevan, completed a lengthy work which he called the Shahristani Johor Chaman, or the region of the Four Meadows, which provides extensive contemporary descriptions of Azar-Kevan and his followers. And among the many virtues of this work is that it quotes from numerous texts associated with Azar-Kevan himself that are no longer extant. In one such text here, entitled The Mirror of Alexander, we learn, for instance, that Azar-Kevan held that the difference in religious traditions was one that only existed in name and not in content. Thus, in Sanskrit, one says Pandita Smaranika, in Persian, one says Mubad, and in Arabic, one says Mutakalam. Right? So these refer to three different sort of religious officials in each of these three different religious traditions. Likewise, one says Sannyasi in Sanskrit, one says Hirbed in Persian, that is Zoroastrian Persian, one says Sufi in Arabic. Continues. But the text goes on to say that the difference between these terms is only in the signifier and not in the signified. Just like the Persian word ab, the Arabic word ma, the Turkish word su, and the Hindi word pani all refer to the same thing. They all refer to water. The Shahristan also tells us a little further on an exegetical remark made by Azar-Kevan given to the Quranic passage that mankind was a single community, then God sent prophets bearing good tidings and warnings to them, and they formed their differences. And the Shahristan says that Azar-Kevan held that one can find God through all religions, Jamia Adyon, and reach him by all roads, Behar Ra, and that there is no road that doesn't terminate in God. Then it likens religions to the branches of a single tree, saying, after all, a tree has one root, even if its branches are many. Thus, this is the explanation, which is the fruit of the tree. In all religions, which are similar to the branches of the tree, the fruit does not vary in taste. This passage is, as I said, an exegesis of a well-known Quranic passage understood to describe humanity during the period between Adam and Noah. And while the passage is normally interpreted to explain man's fall from the religion of truth and the necessity of prophets to restore humanity to God's law, here the passage is instead taken as a statement approving of human diversity. Further, again, with the Shahristan here for just one more quote, we read that Azar-Kevan used to say in conversations with his Sufi friends that Sufis ought not to be partisan and should act in the same manner with fellow travelers of all different kinds. Just as one spends time with Muslims, one also should befriend Hindus, Jews, Zoroastrians, and Christians. And therefore, one cannot act according to the decrees of the jurists of the age, for they are complicit in jihad and murder, interestingly, using jihad in the sort of negative sense here, and thereby deny the obligatory, here understood to mean a sort of notion of universal peace. Bahram ibn Farhad, the author of the Shahristan, was an important early influence on Mubad. Mubad met him in Lahore in 1638 when he was 20 years old. His Shahristan became a major source for Mubad's description of the life of Azar-Kevan. But while Bahram's composition focused almost exclusively on the circles of Azar-Kevan and his followers, Mubad's project would take him across the Indian subcontinent and beyond in search of religious knowledge. Here, Mubad's own description, again, from a passage describing the beliefs of the Azar-Kevani mystics, that one should spend time with diverse peoples. He says they call this practice the mixing of cultures, Amizesh Farhang. And he also says they also call it Mise Chor. I'm not exactly sure what that's meant to mean, perhaps table manners. When someone foreign to their group is introduced to their assembly, they do not speak coarsely of him, they praise the path of his sect, and they accept what he says and do not overlook even a morsel of politeness and generosity, according to the principle of their sect, namely that one can approach God through every religion. Indeed, in this first chapter of the Dabistan, ostensibly describing the religion of the ancient Persians, Mubad writes that Azar-Kevan attracted followers not just among what he calls Persians, but also among Muslims, Christians, Hindus, and others. So I don't have much time left for my presentation. Just before I conclude, I thought I would just share a very brief account of how Mubad, excuse me, goes about describing diverse religious communities. On this slide, images of the idols of the various planets. I'll just very briefly share a small portion of Mubad's description of the religion of the Tibetans, whom he presumably met in Kashmir during the perhaps later part of the 1630s or early 1640s. In his description of the Tibetans, he says the Tibetans call God Kojak in the Tibetan language, and they consider him to be incorporeal, uncompounded, and omnipotent. They assert that he manifests himself in three forms like the Hindus. They say that if someone should apprehend God, he will speak to him without mouth or tongue. This is a condition of prophethood. They say that the spirit, ruh, is pre-eternal, and that spirits are sent down to this world. If the soul recognizes itself in God, it enters the upper world. If not, it remains in the world of dust. This beginning of the Tibetan section outlines their view of the divine nature. Topics that are important topics in the study of Islamic philosophy and theology come up again and again in Mubad's descriptions of various sects, such as God's incorporeality, his uncompounded nature, his simple nature, and his omnipotence are all commonplace opinions among Muslim philosophers about the essence of God. And thus, from the outset, the commensurability between Tibetan doctrine and a kind of universal monotheism is established. The author then proceeds to liken the belief of the Tibetans to those of the Hindus, referring to the Hindu belief in Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahadev as the three causes of effects in the world. Mubad notes that the Tibetans believe divine speech to be incorporeal, which is a common theme both in Sufi literature and in Azar-Kevani thought itself, and that those who are able to communicate with the divine are themselves prophets. And finally, the passage succinctly describes metaphysics and the doctrine of metempsychosis. I'll just skip a couple of these slides because I don't want to take up too much of our time here. But what I want to note through all of this in his descriptions of all of the religious traditions that he encounters is that Mubad gives very detailed accounts of the terminology that is used in different religious traditions to refer to both their ideas of God and their sort of ritual practice. So, for instance, here in the passage on the Tibetans, Mubad tells us that they have idol temples or botkhane, which they call in Tibetan chote, and they venerate these places. Their kalma, their statement of faith, is Om Mani Padme Hum. The custom is for anyone who has two sons to commit one of them to poverty on the path of God. Even if the king himself has two sons, he commits one to poverty, makes one a saint, a dervish in his terms. They believe in the two abodes, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, many of these young mendicants go and set out on pilgrimage to Lhasa. When they return from Lhasa, they become known as lamas, i.e. pilgrims, and he uses here the term haji. I haven't got time to go into much more detail about the specific accounts that Mubad gives here, but hopefully I've given you guys a taste of the sort of interesting character of this work and the kinds of descriptions that one can find in it. It's a very long text, so to give anything other than a taste would be impossible in an hour. I just want to wrap up my presentation here, returning to the poetry of Mubad. It seems that getting back to the questions with which I began this lecture, the identity of the author of the Dabistan and some of the reasons why he composed this text, it would seem from the literature that has been published on the Dabistan that Mubad is frequently described as a Zoroastrian or even as a Parsi, here perhaps confusing his description of the religion of the Persians, the Mazahib Parsiyan, with the sort of contemporary usage of the word Parsi, meaning a Zoroastrian of Western Indian, Gujarati extraction. For someone who set out ostensibly to classify the religions of the world known to him, Mubad carefully couches his own identity in ambiguity. Like Azar Kevan himself, he seems to have, taken every opportunity to explicitly distance himself from one or another religious tradition. In fact, his very name, Mirza Zulfiqar Azar Sasani, refers in the first part to Zulfiqar, the sword of Ali, the first Shi'i Imam. And in the second part, Azar Sasani refers to him as being a descendant of the pre-Islamic Sasanian dynasty of Iran. Even his pen name, Mubad, or Magus, Zoroastrian priest, is frequently read as Mu'abbad in poetry, or the eternal one. So even in his pen name, there's a certain amount of ambiguity. To conclude, I just want to read this poem here, in which Mubad writes that the Turanians think I am Iranian. The Iranians say I'm not one of them. The Sunnis think I'm Shi'i. The Shi'is think I must not be Muslim. The atheists think I'm one of them. I'm like a Christian or a Jew. I'm outside of all religions. I am the absolute Gnostic of the Lord. A man who has met his goal does not travel. I have obtained union with all souls. I am the most knowledgeable knower of the nature of truth. I am the Archmagus of God. While this poem is undated, it's tempting to see it as expressive of Mubad's goal in composing the Dabistan. As someone who moves between an enormous number of different religious groups, Mubad ultimately claims that he has obtained union with all souls and no longer has any necessity of traveling. Perhaps this poem was written near the end of his life. In this talk, we've argued that the composition of the Dabistan is, on the one hand, something that we can ascribe with certainty to a man called Zulfiqar Azar Sasani Mubad, as I think have indicated, with a number of manuscript testimonies. We can also see the composition of the Dabistan as being an extension of the kinds of spiritual exercises which the followers of Azar Kevan had begun to practice already during the 16th century, which aimed at cultivating the perfection of the soul through actions taken with respect to the cosmos, that is the worship of the planets, the body, that is certain dietary practices and certain yogic breathing practices, and with respect to society, namely in befriending and learning about diverse religious traditions. For a man who spent much of his life traveling to document religious diversity, it is noteworthy here that Mubad now claims that he is a man who has met his goal and need not travel. And I think, for those of us who are facing our own travel restrictions and our own inabilities to travel, perhaps we can take some solace in this notion here at the end of the talk. Thank you so much for your attention, and I cannot wait to hear your questions.
Thank you, Dan, for a very beautiful explanation of what this text is and who the author was. In fact, I mean, personally speaking, I was able to learn much from this talk of yours. Uh, you know, I have actually not gone through this Dabistan uh, as a whole. I have just seen sections of it, at a time when I was writing a paper on the Shias in India. Professor Habib suggested to me to consult Dabistan and Mazahib, and there are certain passages which are which I found very very interesting regarding the schism between the Shias and the Sunnis, and the type of allegations which are being put on each other. I mean, in fact, that I found some of those quite hilarious, and some of them pointing out to the fact that whosoever the author is, he's neither a Shia nor a
Yeah.
Sunni. Because I mean, that was my take after reading those passages. You told us details about from where he imbibed his ideas, the life of Mohammed, and so on and so forth. But before I start putting up questions to you, which have been asked, I would ask you if you could tell us something about yet another aspect of Dabistan,
Hmm.
which has been dealt with by a number of scholars, but somehow seems to have not been discussed here.
Hmm.
The Sikhs, for that matter,
Yes.
the Sikh religion. So,
Yes.
what type of information do we find in this text? I mean, my intention of asking this question is so that the large number of young people listening to this lecture may also come to know that the Bistani Mazahib is a very good source for the understanding of what Sikhism was during this period. There is also a question on that, but I will ask you that later on.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nadeem Bhai, for your remarks and for your invitation to talk about the chapter on Sikhism. It's I think in terms of this talk, I wanted, in fact, to devote part of the talk to the chapter on Sikhism, and simply didn't have time to sort of include everything that I wanted to get in, and so wound
Exactly.
up trying to keep the Tibetans instead because they were shorter.
Yeah.
So, as you say, one of the uh, aspects of the Dabistan that has attracted the most attention since its publication in 1809 is its first-hand account of the author's travels through the Punjab and his encounters with Gur Har Gobind and numerous sort of stories which relate to Guru Nanak. Um, and the text is absolutely sort of replete with details which describe both sort of the political conditions of the Sikhs as Mubad encountered them, and also the sort of doctrinal positions and accounts of practice of the Sikhs, again as they were told to Mubad. Interestingly, it's this section on the Sikhs that differs quite tremendously between the first and the second recensions of the Devastation as well. So you not only have an enormous amount of detail about the Sikhs here, but also you get a sense that between 1650 and 1653 or thereabouts, that on certain points Mubad needed to change what he had said. And in fact, he says at the beginning of the 1653 text that I had to tear up some of what I said in the chapter of the Indians on the basis of sort of new information, that it's no longer valid. So also studying the differences in these texts in and of itself can be interesting. But just to sum up very briefly about what the text presents, in the first edition, the 1650 edition, the Sikhs, or the Nanak Panthis as he calls them, are described as being a section of the religion of the Indians, the Hindus. They have their own chapter in the first recension, and basically what the chapter begins by Mubad describing the Nanakpanthis as being non-idolatrous Hindus. That is, they forbid the usage of idols to do their sort of normal sort of religious practice. The text, very interestingly, also sheds a lot of light on the intersection between Sikh practice and Muslim practice. In the presentation of Guru Nanak, the text more or less says that Guru Nanak followed the Sharia on a number of different points, such as the prohibition of pork and wine. And so I think the broader picture that emerges in this text is one of a formative Sikh community, which from the outsider perspective that Mubad brings, as well as from his universalist perspective, he's very quick to identify with various aspects of other Hindu communities and with various aspects of Islam as well, but which is sort of constantly in a kind of tension with the actual political events that are happening on the ground with the Sikh community, and which actually caused him, I think, to have to revise what he says about the Sikhs over the course of the 1650s. I should also say I presented, on one of my slides, translations of the Dabasan into various languages. And I should say that the section on the Sikhs, of course, has also been translated into Punjabi. So for anyone who prefers to read these texts in Indian languages rather than in English, and in fact, you really should read this in Punjabi or Persian, because the English translation is so bad, that's also there. Yeah.
Well, let us start with the questions which have been put up. There is a question by Mr. Ali Haider. He says, thanks for this wonderful discussion. I want to know that why Buddhists don't find mention in Dabistan Mazahib. And does the author of this book refer to Sikhs as Nanakpanthis as distinct from the other religious groups? And do we know the author of this work in detail? Was he a Parsi? I think the last part of the question has already been answered by Dan, but okay, Dan.
I can try to sort of summarize what I said on that as well. So first question as to the Buddhists. As I sort of, the Buddhists are mentioned in as much as Tibetan Buddhism is discussed in the chapter on the Tibetans. However, in the section on the beliefs of the Indians, on the beliefs of the Hindus, there is also a chapter which is called a lesson on what they call Buddha Mimamsa. But what is actually described in that chapter is not what we would normally identify as Buddhism, but rather what we would identify as Jainism. And so there's a fairly detailed account of Mubad's encounters with Jain mendicants in Gujarat in that chapter. I'm not entirely clear on why the author thinks that should be called Buddha Mimamsa rather than something else, but that's what comes through. There are a number of groups that strike one as being absent from this text. It's not just the Buddhists, but for instance, in his chapter on the Jews, the only Jew that Mubad can find is Sarmad. He doesn't seem to know of the existence of any Indian Jewish communities, of the Bani Israel, for instance, or anything along those lines. Your other questions on the Nanakpanthis, they are subsumed under the general category of the Indian religions, the religions of, I'm always sort of torn as to whether to translate this as the religions of the Indians or the religions of the Hindus, because there's a sort of ambiguity that underlies that term in early modern Persian. And then finally, as to the question of whether he was a Parsi, I mean, the short answer is, if by what you mean, if you mean what we all sort of conventionally mean when we use the word Parsi, then no. There probably was not a Zoroastrian, a sort of Parsi community, one that's genetically related to the Parsi community of Gujarat in Patna in 1618. Nor does he really seem to have any sort of deep knowledge of, say, Zoroastrian ritual practice, the kind of practice that you would expect a Parsi Mubed to have. Doesn't really seem to know the Avestan language at all. He doesn't seem to know anything about performing the kind of daily rituals that Parsi priests do. So rather, what I say is that he's a follower of this fairly esoteric Iranian thinker, Azar Kevan, who claimed that he was reviving what he called the Dine Parsi, the Persian religion. And so you find references to the Persians throughout the Dabistan, but it doesn't mean the same thing that the term Parsi conventionally means.
Right, sir. There are a number of questions by Dr. Syed Ali Kazim. So first I will take up the questions by Ali Kazim one by one, and then we will go to the others.
Right.
Did he talk about Shia orthodoxy being the creed of Safavids during his stay at Mashhad, or was he does he simply avoid the details of Sunni persecution in Iran?
Right. He certainly doesn't shy away from questions of persecution in Iran, but what he focuses on primarily there is the persecution of what he calls the Wahidis, or the Monists, the Unitarians, which are the Noktavis rather than the Sunnis. And he gives a fairly long account of Shah Abbas's persecution of disciples, initiates in the Noktavi order. And we know from other sources as well, from sources from the reign of Shah Abbas, that Shah Abbas saw the Noktavis as a threat to his imperial legitimacy. They had previously, as Catherine Babayan so elegantly outlined, played a sort of major role in early Safavid imperial ideology, but were becoming an unstable element in society, and Shah Abbas saw it as necessary to quell that sort of Noktavi element. Many of the Noktavis, incidentally, found a sort of welcome shelter at the court of Akbar in India, and in fact, Akbar himself was accused of having sympathies for the Noktavis, indeed of being a Noktavi himself, by Badawi in the Muntakhab Tawarikh. So it's here mostly that one finds discussion of Safavid persecution. The discussion of Shiism in the Dabistan, as Nadim Bhai has already alluded, is very interesting. It's very idiosyncratic as well. Among other things, the Dabistan describes fairly extreme forms of Shiism, I guess you could say, that, for instance, according to Mubad, he encountered Shi'is who held that the Quran originally comprised 2 extra surahs, and reproduces the text of one of these surahs in the Dabistan. These are the Surat al-Walaya and the Surat al-Nur. The Surat al-Nurain.
Yeah.
So its perspective on Shiism is itself interesting and problematic, and yeah, I'll leave it at that for right now.
The second question by Dr. Ali Kazim. Dabistan covers Sadiqis and Ilahi Kesh in 2 chapters. Are they still in existence?
This is a good question. When he talks about Ilahis, he's talking about Akbar, and he's talking about the devotees of the Dine Ilahi. And he says that he has that at first hand from someone who was present at the Ebodat Khone during the debates. However, many of the figures in those debates are anonymous, and so it's not entirely clear to me how sort of fanciful we should take the debates to be. There is someone who's simply referred to as the think he's a hakim or something like that. He's he's a philosopher. Sorry, not a hakim, a hakim in the debates. And it's this hakim that keeps having the sort of best points in the debates, and ultimately is the one who outlines Akbar's claim to be the true divine Khalifa. So during Mobed's own time, the Illahis and the Sadiqis were both living traditions. The text also describes the Roshanis of Afghanistan as being another of these living traditions. But no, they are not still extant. A lot of this sort of religious fervor today would simply be subsumed under more modernist categories of Islam.
The third question by Sayyid Ali Kazim is, there is no denying the fact that the author was a Parsi. I want to ask about his views on Mazdakite ideas and Manichaeism, as Ziabarni refers to money as mani malum.
Yep. So, I mean, here it's simply a question of what do you mean by Parsi? If what you mean by Parsi is, what is typically understood within the Parsi community to mean Parsi, that is someone who comes from a certain number of lineages from a community which emigrated from Iran to India sometime perhaps by the 10th century of the Common Era, who lived in Gujarat, who practiced a sort of strict separation between a lay population and a priestly population. Priestly population that maintained a set of ritual practices in the Avestan language, daily sacrifices made at fire temples. Then Mubad himself says he doesn't belong to that group. He describes that group. He calls them Zartoshti or Zardoshti. And he says that the Zardoshtis are those who do not recognize the words of Zarathustra to be allegorical and metaphorical. And he knows that group in some detail. He summarizes books that would have circulated among the Parsi community of Gujarat. He summarizes a book called the Sad Dar and the Zartoshname, the Book of Zarathustra. But he's quite explicit that he's not a part of that community. Rather, he calls him, the group that he is most closely aligned with is a group that is described as Sepasi in that first chapter. He also, as you say here, he also does describe the sort of transmitted ideas of Mazdak and in another section of the chapter. And indeed, I think many of the ideas that one finds in ancient descriptions of Mazdakism or early Islamic descriptions of Mazdakism find resonance with what Azar Kevan is teaching. That is the notion that the world, cyclically repeats itself, that souls transmigrate from one body to the next after death. That ideal practices, are forms of vegetarianism and so on. One finds all of that already in descriptions of Mazdakites from late antiquity. The text also says, though, that there are still living Mazdakites and living, members of other Persian religious traditions, which, according to Mobed, are mixed up with the peoples of Islam, and that their followers have Muslim names and only practice these Persian religions in secret. So what one makes of that is a bit difficult, I think, to really pin down, because it, either you believe, you take Mubad for his word, that these religious traditions, which are not attested as living between late antiquity and early modernity, were practiced in secret somewhere and simply don't enter into the historical record, or something else must be going on. As for Mani, he describes Mani in small places here and there. He knows the Arjang was a text composed by Mani, but there's not great detail there.
The last question, which I would take from Ali Kazim, is could we categorize Dabistan into the genre of heresiography as that of Sunni heresiography being written by Al-Ashari, Al-Baghdadi, or Ibn Hazm, or the Shia heresiography being compiled by Nawabakhti and Qummi?
Yeah, this is a terrific question. Mobad himself acknowledges that his work is being done in response, I think, to heresiography. At the conclusion of the text, he says, essentially that the works of Shahrastani, that is Kitab al-Malam al-Nihal, and the Tafsirat al-Avam, which is attributed to Dai al-Razi, are both filled with what he calls Janeb Rui, or partisanship. And he says that what he tried to accomplish in the Dabistan was a work that could not be called partisan, could not be called Janeb Rui, or that could not be accused of ta'assub or zealotry. But I think that there are a lot of features which the Dabistan shares with these works. Karl Ernst, a colleague of mine, wrote a very important paper a couple of years ago. It was a talk that he gave at the K.R. Kamal Oriental Institute in Bombay, outlining a place in which Shahrastani gives a sort of typology of religions and positions ranging from atheist to materialist to sort of traditionist. And in Shahrastani's formulation, traditionist is sort of the best position. Whereas in the Dabistan, the same typology is given, but it's somewhat inverted in the chapter on the Sufis at the very end. In the chapter, I forget if it's the chapter of the Sufis or the chapter on the philosophers, in which instead Mubad says that, in fact, it is not the traditionists, but the universalists, those who see all religious traditions as leading to a single telos, as being the ideal position. So, it's a different kind of heresiography, I think, than the Sunni and Shia heresiographies that you talk about here, but certainly shares a lot of features with them.
There's a question by one of our students, Zainab Naqvi. Now, Zainab, first of all, thanks you, and then asks, how do you see the absence of an authorship for a work so detailed and layered? Does it appear accidental or intentional on the part of the author, for he underplayed his own identity and religion for the sake of objectivity with which he has dealt with the various religions in the text?
Thank you, Zainab. That's a terrific question, and one that I've really struggled with, I think, in my own work on Mubad and trying to figure all of these sort of various sources which point to his life out, is that, on the one hand, you have a text that is so specific in documenting the dates in which the author met various figures. And yet his name essentially only comes up in his own poetic compositions, which are, frequently interspersed throughout the text. So if you know to recognize Mubad, from his Takhalus or his Lagab in those poetic compositions, then of course you would say, oh, this is the author's poetry. But there's no place in the introduction where he says, I am Zulfikar Azar Salsani Mubad. I'm composing this text, at the bequest of, who knows, Abdullah Qutb Shah or something like that. There's no sort of typical introduction that one might find, in another work, like a work of court history. And so, one really does have to come to this kind of conclusion that there is a kind of feigned self-effacement from the text that I think is not just underplaying his identity for the sake of objectivity, but I think is also something that we could tie to something of a Sufi notion of the obliteration of the self in a moment of divine realization and a divine and a kind of ecstasy. It seems that in his ecstatic poetry, anyway, Mubad claims that he is one with all, that he's joined with all souls and so on. And I think if we read it in that light, perhaps the effacement of the self might in fact be, trying to position himself as being a sort of a Gnostic with a uniquely privileged sense of universal religion. But thank you. That's my
Well,
question.
there is a question by Dr. Akhlaq Ahan. Uh, he says, thanks, Dr. Dan, for the wonderful talk. Yes, I agree with you. It was a wonderful talk indeed. Just one point. In the Sufistic term,
Yeah.
tahqiq means, unlike simple literal meaning, research,
Yes.
pursuing or longing for the truth, and probably the poet too aims to convey the same. And a brief question, why he mentions Islam, Roshaniyas, Ilahis, and Sufis in different chapters? Does he consider them different faith systems, though all considered themselves as part of Islamic faith?
Thank you, Dr. Ahan. Those are terrific points and questions. In fact, there's a long section on tahqiq that I had to sort of take out of this paper, but it'll be there in the published form. Indeed, I think that you're absolutely right that this is what he means. That on the one hand, the term, as you say, is pursuing truth or longing for truth, and it's often contrasted also with taqlid, right? So on the one hand, there's a sense of independent verification rather than following what others have done, but as you say, it has this sort of strong connotation of a absolute devotion to finding the truth wherever it leads you. Yeah. Now, as to the second part of this question, this is I think really one of the challenging aspects of the Dabistan, and if you think about the table of contents of the Dabistan, which I could put up on a slide maybe, but maybe I'll just skip that. Islam, the chapter on Islam is the middle chapter, right? So you sort of start with these ancient religions, Parsi religion, which in his description goes back millions of years, Hindu religion, and so on. Then it goes into the sort of historical, Ahl Kitab kind of religions, Abrahamic religions, if you will, Judaism and Christianity, and then Islam. And then from that sort of point at which he talks about traditionalist Islam, doctrinal Islam, he then seems to shift in the way that he describes the subsequent chapters. That he's no longer now talking about things of the past, historical religions, but he's now talking about developments, all of which really emanate from Islam, but which take this sort of more sort of philosophical, allegorical interpretation of Islamic doctrine. And so it's here that, as you say, you find the chapter on the Noktavis, which he calls the Wahidis. You find the chapter on the Sadiqis, the chapter on the Roshanis, Ilahis, the Philosopha, and the Sufis are the last two chapters. The chapter on Sufism is his last chapter, and it seems like that's kind of the most important group for him, right? That if the sort of ancient wisdom, it comes from the Persians and the Hindus first and foremost, the sort of modern groups who are investigating this to the greatest extent are the philosophers and the Sufis. Ultimately, what seems clear to me is that that Mubad presents all of these different religions as seemingly different, but actually all the same. And so I'm not sure if you were to ask Mubad, whether he thought that the Roshanis or the Ilahis were Muslim. I'm pretty sure he would say yes, but I think he probably would also have thought that everyone, in a sense, was Muslim. It's a great question, one that I'm not entirely sure how to really approach in this book yet, but that's, I think, one of the major challenges in understanding Mubad's approach to understanding the tension between universalism and Islam. I mean, I think that's really what's at tension in this work.
No, as you rightly pointed out, that first he deals with the traditional religions, the old religions, comes to Islam, and then deals with all these things. Where does he place Nanak-Panthis?
Nanak-Panthis are at the end of his chapter on the Indians. So he continues to classify them there. And the interesting thing about all of his chapters is, even though they're meant to be sort of about a specific group, he inevitably brings in someone from another group in his discussion. So in his chapter on the in his chapter on the Bairagis, where he talks about Kabir, for instance, he then talks about an Azar Kevani mystic who he said, dressed like a Bairagi and was a follower of Kabir. So similarly, in some of his later chapters, you find references again to Nanak-Panthis and to Azar Kevan followers, and some of these sort of more universalist or philosophically oriented groups.
Well, there's a question by Matt Melvin Koshaki. First, he praises you. Brilliant stuff.
So, yeah.
On the association of planetary ritual with specifically pre-Islamic Persian imperialism, yet drawing rather on Sohrawardi, perhaps also Fakhruddin Razi, would you say that the main departure here is the assertion that such ritual is transcendent of all religious and doctrinal difference? In other words, this is obviously Akbarian, but also Mongol in its scientific universalism. No?
Hi, Matt. Thanks for this great question. As always, you get right to it. Yes, I think is his answer. I think that especially in the Dasatir and in these additional chapters in the Dasatir, I mean, what it would seem is that the editor of the Dasatir, who included these prayers in Avestan and in Sanskrit and in Hindi, or Hindavi, I guess, and in Turkish and in Arabic, is really taking great pains to prove that worshipping the first cause through its emanations, namely the planets and so on, is something that all religious systems in their sort of most philosophical forms can be reduced to, and that this is indeed the sort of transcendent perennial ritual in both Azar Kevan's own view, I would suppose, and also in that of Mubad. The interesting aspect to me of all of this is that the sort of founder of the European discipline of comparative religion, Max Muller famously argued that in sort of its most primeval state, religion was sun worship, and here you would seem to find a close parallel to that someone like Mubad, who is also involved in a comparative enterprise, seems to say that in one way or another, the various religious systems of the world that he is familiar with all in one, boil down to an adoration of the first cause through its natural emanations. Nadim, I think you're muted.
Yeah. There's a question by Ines Zupanov. I'm sorry if I am mispronouncing the name. Thank you so much on this wonderful lecture. If there is time, I would like to know more on Christianity and what were his sources or inspirations.
All right. Thank you. I'm afraid that I haven't done as much reading in that chapter as I ought to have. But my understanding of Mubad's understanding of Christianity is that it comes primarily from the Portuguese and primarily from Portuguese interlocutors whom he met in various places. that is, Ozar Kevan himself was supposed to have had a Portuguese follower, and at various places, especially when he's in North India, he encounters Jesuit missionaries, and in some places also Portuguese merchants in his travels. I should also say that, just sort of building on this, in a chapter that I've done a little bit more research on, thanks to a very wonderful student of mine who wrote an MA thesis on Sarmad, the Dabistan in its chapter on Judaism also gives a Persian rendition of the first chapters of the Book of Genesis, as it was translated by this Iranian Jew turned Sufi turned Universalist, Sarmad, and his friend, an Indian boy by the name of Abhay Chand. Together, the two of them translated the first chapters of the Book of Genesis. And you can actually compare those chapters with other other Persian translations of the Book of Genesis, and there it seems that translation is independent of European texts, and has some commonalities with the transmission of the Pentateuch by Iranian Jews in Iran, rather than coming from European sources. So I think those are the two different directions that he has information on the biblical religions.
Well, I had missed a follow-up question by Matt. So let's have Matt once again. He wants to follow up on the comment which you made. Mohabbat's emphasis on the need to exist the body jibes nicely with the modern literature and out of the body and near death experiences, which tend to have a very similar post religious tenor.
I mean, I think that's an interesting
comment. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think that's a very interesting aspect of these texts. And it gets to something that I didn't have time to discuss here, which is the sort of modern reception of these texts in first in the 19th century among theosophists, and sort of also colonial era Indian scholars who are in dialogue with Christian missionaries and with theosophists. I mean, ultimately, I think that a text like this has a lot to do with first Western understandings of Sufism, and ultimately with the emergence of New Age ideas. And I think that this isn't simply sort of New Agers finding a sort of text that they think is cool, but there is a sort of commonality to the experience of someone like Mobad and the experience of some of these sort of more modern actors that you're getting at here.
There is a question by Malini Wagre. Can you suggest one version of the Dabistan in English? I know you said the translations are not the best in English. Then is there one in Hindi you can suggest to be better than the others available? What is a good place to start reading this for a beginner? And if you can also, I mean, I would just add to that, any good Urdu translation as well, if there is.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the text is very long. And for this reason, it has not been translated in its entirety since those 19th century translations that I put up on a slide. So the English translation, as I said, was done in 1843 under less than optimal circumstances. Right? It was the first translator of the text, who was sort of an enterprising Irishman who thought he could get rich in India, didn't, but knew some Persian and Arabic, and began, getting these kinds of commissions. Began translating the text, and then died 20% of the way through it, and then it was picked up by another sort of enterprising Austrian soldier who, again, worked primarily on commissions from the Oriental Translation Fund. it is unfortunately all there really is if you want the whole text in English. Um, the It's been reprinted many times, both in India and in the States, or both in India and the States and the UK. You can find it on Amazon, I think, for quite little. Um, the easiest translation to get, the easiest version of this translation to get hold of, is a one-volume abridgment, um, which is simply called Oriental Literature: the Dabistan, which was abridged by the Columbia professor Abraham Valentine Williams Jackson, and he at least was a pretty good. He was a great Zoroastrian scholar and a pretty good Persianist as well. So he at least fixed some of their errors in his abridgment. But it's far from perfect. He didn't know Islam very well, so those chapters aren't good. So really, what we need is a new translation, and that's something that I have begun working on, and something that I hope to be able to complete in the coming years. As for Hindi translations, to the best of my knowledge, there is not a Hindi translation of the Devastation in its entirety, although excerpts, especially on the chapters on the Sikhs, are out there. I had a slide with the Punjabi translation, and I took it out, but I imagine that there's also a Hindi translation from the same organization. As for the Urdu translation of Shradharam Piluri is very, very close to the original text. So it's almost a mechanical Urdu translation from Persian, which means that if you are very well educated in Urdu, you can just read it quite easily. But if you don't have familiarity with the sort of religious concepts that come up in the Dabistan, then it can be a bit opaque, because it's filled with technical vocabulary drawn from Sufism. And you really need to be a scholar with some familiarity with those terms to be able to read it comfortably in Urdu. So that's unfortunately where we are. What I would recommend instead of any of this, though, is, as I said, it's a long text. It's hard to read cover to cover in any of its translations. Instead, I would recommend starting with some of the wonderful articles that have been written about the Dabistan over the last several years. For beginners, I think, who are just getting interested in a text like this, there are a couple of introductory articles which give a good sense as to its contents, and give excerpts in translation. These include Attar Ali's Pursuing an Elusive Seeker of Universal Truth, another article by my late colleague at the University of Pennsylvania, Aditya Bell, Pages from the Book of Universal Religion. Professor Habib has done his own translations into English of some of the sections on the Sikhs. I put up a collection of articles and sources on my Facebook page in a Dropbox folder for anyone who's interested in the Dabistan to have a look at. And perhaps Professor Azvi, we could maybe even add that to the Ganga Jamuni page or something along those lines too, if anyone would like to download those things.
Well, thank you very much for that. Putting up those things. These are almost all the important articles have been put up by you at one place, and I think those are some of those which should be read by all. But before I hand over to Shagufta and thank you, just one last question which has been asked. That is by Sheikh Ilyas. That is, how rich is Dabistan to study the encounter between Islam and Hinduism? And can you suggest a good English translation? The last one you have already dealt, but the first question, if you could answer.
I mean, I would say that it's very rich. It's a complete description of Hinduism from the perspective of someone who is much more familiar with the Persian tradition and Islam, in a way that other texts from the period are not. In that the text, takes great effort to describe a diversity of beliefs and a diversity of practices among various groups of Hindus, various sects of Hinduism, and tries also to provide accounts of holy people, holy men, saints, ascetics, yogis, some of which can be very funny in describing some of the antics of some of the more fakir type, kalandar type yogis that are out there, and some of which can be sort of very philosophically edifying as well. It gives an extensive description, not just of Vaishnavism, but of Shaivism and Vedanta and Mimamsa, all of which the author tries to understand in his own sort of peculiar way, as well as Jainism, Namapanthis, and so on. So for those reasons, I think the text really deserves to be better known and to receive a sort of more rigorous translation than what it currently has. It's different than what you get when you read Darshako. It's different than what you get when you read, the translations of Mahabharata and Ramayana into Persian. It's very much a picture of a world that's on the cusp of a lot of change.
Dan, thanks a lot. Let me just conclude by saying that Dabistan Mazahib is one of those texts which actually tell us about the type of society, the type of religious ethos, the type of philosophies which coexisted in India during the past. And the type of discussions, for example, which I hinted about the Shia Sunni thing, that is something which I have read, also points out that this saying that we were living together but separately. All these religions are discussed, but then the frictions between them, they are also brought out very succinctly. Let me also point out to the audience that this type of trying to understand the various religions started much earlier than Darashiko. They started much earlier than Mobed. In fact, in the Abul Fazl's Akbarname, you have full chapters where there is an attempt being made to understand the Indian religions, detailed accounts of Hinduism, Jainism, etc., etc. Let me also point out to the students who are here that it is not only in the Dabistan that we don't find much reference to Buddhism. There might be a term here and there. Dan referred to that there are certain terms, but then the explanation which is being given is of Jainism, not of Buddhism itself. You look up at Akbarnama, the chapter which deals with the religions of India. Again, Buddhism is missing. You look at those discussions at Ibadat Khana, whether described by Abullah Abdul Qadir Badayuni, or by Abul Fazal, or by Arif Kandhari, or by anyone. One prominent group which we should have expected. In fact, I will tell you that a number of textbooks which have been written during the last 20 years or so, they also mention Buddhism. But mind it, that in these Ibadat Khana discussions, Jains are mentioned. All type of people are mentioned, but Buddhists are not mentioned. Probably one of the reasons why Buddhists are being missed is that by 16th century or even earlier, there is hardly any presence of Buddhists in the Indian subcontinent. They are now in central, West Asia, where there is a concentration, because if you go to any of the museums which are there in Dushanbe or Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, there you will find the Buddhist remains and everything. But as far as the Indian subcontinent was concerned, by 16th century, probably the Buddhists were in such a minuscule form that they are hardly mentioned. They are not noticed at all by either Abul Fazl or any of those, even as Dan very well pointed out, that even in the Dabistan Mazahib, we fail to find any mention of them. Dan, thanks a lot once again for a beautiful lecture on this particular aspect. I mean, in fact, at Aligarh, we lack scholarship on such philosophical topics. And I am really thankful, not only to you, but I was expecting when your lecture was scheduled, I was expecting that what would happen during the discussions. I mean, probably it would only be people from outside Aligarh who would be asking you. But thank you to the audience that a number of questions were put up from my Aligarh as well. I mean, that is a credit to you also, Dan, that you spoke in such a manner that everyone uh, could also understand what you were talking about. Thank you very much. Now, Shagufta, would you please formally thank Dan, and also, if possible, tell us about Sunday's lecture?
Sure, sir. Um, Professor Sheffield, this was amazing. This was just incredible. It's a very complex source, I understand. And I'm going to take something from what one of our viewers, Matt Koshiki, has mentioned. This was sort of any author writing something like this has to have or emphasize on out of body or near death experience, which tends to be very similar to post religious tenor. Thank you, Matt, for saying that. What a classic sentence that was. I want to also thank Professor Rizavi for organizing this and curating this in such a fashion that it's coming out almost like a bouquet. That was, like it's been presented to us like a bouquet, and every flower in this bouquet, every little petal is turning out to be such a gem. And thank you so much, our viewers, for constant, continued, consistent support. And here is the weekend's program. Tomorrow, Saturday, at 6:30 Pakistan time and 7 p.m. India time, we have Kya Delhi, Kya Lahore, and that will be here. And speakers are Swapna Little and Professor Tahir Kamran. Then on Sunday at 8 p.m. Now this is important because Sunday is sorry, it's at 8:30 p.m. India time, 3 p.m. GMT. We have Professor Sajjad Rizvi, who will be speaking to us on transnational she networks before colonialism. So please keep this change in mind. So for our series, on Sunday, um, Reflections on Shared Past will be with Professor Sajjad Rizvi, and the timing is 8:30 p.m. So see you all tomorrow at 7 and Sunday at 8:30. Have a great evening, and thank you, professors, for being with us and enlightening us.
Just to add to what Shagufta told us, once again, I would like to inform that there would be times when we would be changing our timings, because during these winter months there might be certain of our senior scholars who may not be comfortable to come at the timings which, for example, although I have in January we have the lecture of Professor Irfan Habib. In fact, two lectures of Irfan Habib are scheduled at the end of January. But once again, I have left the time open to him, and it is quite possible, although at the moment he has assured me that he will speak at 7 p.m. itself, but I am keeping it open that it may be possible that we may hold our program a little earlier. Professor Dr. Sajjad Rizvi has some personal, work which is scheduled at 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time, around 1 o'clock at UK. So that is why he requested me that we should, if possible, postpone it by a few hours. So I hope that it would not be very difficult for the audience to connect at 8:30 p.m. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Good night. Thank you, Professor Sheffield.
Thank you all. This has been a
Thank you.
delight,
Thank
and I
you.
hope to meet you guys in India soon.
Yes, see you in Aligarh very soon.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
Yeah,
Good night.
yeah, we will.
Good night.
Good night.